our journey. Can you believe it?
I know. This Popper one. I mean, why do you think he put this one at the beginning? I'm curious. I can only think of one reason.
So that your bow stroke suddenly has all of the options before you go on to the rest of them, maybe?
Maybe.
This is very interesting,
He's thrown in a lot of little tricks. I mean, honestly, the only reason I think this one is first is because it's in C major. Because it's definitely not the easiest one, is it?
No.
It's deceitfully difficult, I think.
Yeah, not by a long shot. And actually, I think this often puts people off from tackling the whole 40 because they think, God, if this is the easiest one, I'm in trouble, I better stop now. Whereas there are plenty more, as we've all discovered, that are much easier, you know?
Totally. Yeah.
Yes. But we can always do every study in sections, and everything is achievable once you actually know what the plan is or how to go about those little tricky passages, right?
Absolutely. So, there's an interesting marking at the beginning of this one, right? Which they omit from the Bärenreiter one, which is in the original. Basically, Popper tells you just to play with a very free wrist at the heel. And I kind of liked I don't know if you read what is in this little Bärenreiter attachment thing on it, but it's actually, they make a good point, which is that, like, we almost, in modern times, never play anything that's, like, completely a wrist stroke. You know, it's always, like, the arm supporting the wrist. So, yeah. I mean, I thought that was an interesting point, because basically the way we're going to play this is different than how Popper probably would have back in the day.
Absolutely. And thinking about that, I mean, for this type of stroke, I would never choose to play here. Because that is using the arm just only. So I'm taking a little bit of license with the, you know, at the nut being around here, where the bow naturally has a bit of bounce. Like, you would give yourself an injury just using your arm for the whole piece.
Totally, I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. I kind of did middle, lower half, and even doing it that way, it's really, really exhausting for, you know, your arm by the second page. So I don't know how you could really do it just here. I mean, I think you would just do the whole thing
at the lower end somewhere. So this is the whole thing about the wrist, right? That if we weren't doing one a week, if you were spending a couple of weeks on this, that you could actually do really good stop and go practice on this, right? But particularly if you're on the string, which I know you won't be later, but if you actually just only let your wrist move. See the idea that you're really just isolating that little bit of practice. That I think suddenly does give you more freedom when you eventually get off. Just to be aware of that movement that we don't use.
Totally. I'm so glad you demonstrated it that way, because sometimes I find with students is that, like, a lot of times, not so much with this kind of stroke, but usually with, like, a spiccato or, like, faster staccato stroke, a lot of times people try, like, kind of as you demonstrated slowly, only to make the stroke from the wrist. But then when you played it faster, it's actually that when you're isolating that, you're doing that so your wrist has more independence when you're actually playing. It's never that you're only moving the wrist, because that would be like
well, again, that's as ridiculous as only using the arm if we were down there. So that's fascinating for me, is the fact that the wrist is really helpful when you're crossing two strings, and this study really has a lot of that. So you're using your fingers to get up there, but also it's really a combination of all three, isn't it?
Totally. And speaking of bow, I'll tell you what I love about this one, is that it starts on an up bow. It starts on an up bow. So the reason I love that is because, like, most rep does not start on an up bow. Like, the downbeat starts on a down bow. So he's like immediately like, oh, you think this is going to be normal? No, it's going to be not the way you think. And I actually always tell, like, I do this myself, but I also always tell my students when they practice scales, like, start everything always on an up bow when you're practicing scales or arpeggios, because you're just strengthening that. You know, the up bow is always going to, like, naturally be weaker unless you're really working on it. So I like
that's
that
a great idea. And similarly like that with scales, I would get students to start their scales at the very top because they never start them at the top. And often we'll find it's just anything that can take you out of your normal practice rut that you can do. And in orchestral rep, of course, you have to start at the tip and often on an up bow, which if you haven't practiced will suddenly have you going, I don't know how to start on my up bow. So that's a great skill. I like it. All of these areas. So at the beginning, we need to really think about the elbow and how the elbow actually does lead the movement.
Yeah.
No matter how much of the fingers, which obviously will help, but then later in this crazy area where you're doing, that.
Yeah.
That really, there's a kind of circular motion going on that whole time. So this brings me back to my bow circle, fanaticism.
This is the study for bow circles, I have to say. And I think,
again, it's an amazing
the up bow, I don't know if you found this, but like that up bow pattern with the triplets, you do like, sort of when you get into a groove, you can get confused if you haven't sort of analyzed, like the circular motions.
Absolutely. Do you think we should just describe the bow circle idea?
Please. I mean, it's Popper one, so you might as well.
I feel like this is going to live with us through a lot of the studies as we go through them all. So the idea being, this was a Steve Doan idea he talked about quite a lot in lessons. So all of the Eastman heads, and we have some of those guests later coming to us, we'll be talking about this, where you only have two options in the bow. So if you think about this part of the bow and have a look at the circle. So the very first circle is a clockwise circle. And then the next one that happens, because we're on an up bow from a higher string going to a lower string on a down bow, that's an anti-clockwise circle. So straight away in the first bar, there are 4 different string crossings there, but 2 and 2 in different directions. Yeah. So let's explain very carefully. Yeah.
Just a little thing to add, because I've never said this to you, but in America we call anti-clockwise counterclockwise. So in case anyone's wondering what that means.
I never knew that. See, Popper is a learning day.
Anti-clockwise is a much better term because they start with different letters. There's like clockwise and counterclockwise. If you're wanting to write in your music which direction your bow circles are going.
This is why we have cellists from all around the world, because, we just keep giving to each other as this goes on.
Sorry to interrupt your bow circle flow, so please continue.
I'm really, really glad you did. But this is the whole idea, that basically in the first bar, so we've got, what happens is you only really ever have 2 options, or for your brain 4 options. If you're going from an up bow to a down bow, from a lower string to a higher, that will always be clockwise, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, the same stroke is if you're going from a down bow on an upper string to an up bow on a lower. It's the same motion. So that's still the same direction. It's still clockwise. So you've already cured half of your bow string crossings forever once you've internalized that. And then if you start from a down bow on a lower string to an up bow on the upper string, that is counterclockwise. Woo!
Yeah.
Or anti-clockwise. And then similarly, if you're doing an up bow from a higher string to a down bow on a lower string. So it's the same thing. You've only 2 options, but they come across in 4 different scenarios, let's say, when you're thinking about it. So when I'm thinking about that first bar, it's an up bow to a down bow. It's a clockwise circle. We stay there. Now an up bow to a down bow from a higher string to a lower, which is an anti-clockwise or counterclockwise. Back to clockwise. Anti-clockwise. And then we've got the same. It keeps on going in that. So there are bars in here, I'm sure you have some favourites as well, that were just a little bit confusing in the string crossings, which was Popper's idea, right? What did
I'll tell you one I thought was a really good example of bow circles, but also just in the same way we'll talk about the left hand and finding patterns. And a lot of times when things are difficult, it's because they don't follow a consistent pattern or there's something different in there. It's the same with bow circles, right? So I found, for example, bar 60 and this whole ending passage is a great example of that, where if you're just going through blindly, not thinking about this, those string crossings are quite hard.
Yes.
But once you find the pattern, which is that I think of it kind of in a big bracket, like this is my clockwise motion. Now my anti-clockwise, back to clockwise. And it follows a pattern. So once you figured it out for like one bar there, you realize, oh yeah, well that eliminates all the confusion and string crossing practice I need to do for this last passage.
I love that. And it even happens, does it happen bar 59 as well?
It does as well, yeah.
And it's, even though obviously this time we're only skipping one string, so it kind of leads us in there gently. And it's very important. I love what you just said there, because quite often, something hard, you'll find that the same circle goes over 2 string crossings, which eventually cuts out the difficulty level. So anti-clockwise, but clockwise. So that very last one.
Yeah.
It's just such a nice natural movement. So if you can get your brain, I would definitely have practice.
Yeah.
Bow and open strings for that last section, because it's a brain melt, I think.
But I think, I'm sure we're going to talk about this more, but it's, how do you learn these in a week? And how do you learn things quickly and efficiently? Because, as you know, Ailbhe, time is money. This is how. Just take like a teeny bit of time to analyze some things, and then you don't need to like slog through. You're practicing in an intelligent way that actually informs a larger passage, and it's kind of a lot of work like to get used to thinking that way, but then once you do, it saves you so much time and you just feel better for it, I think.
Yeah, and also that cuts out when you're practicing and you feel like you haven't really achieved anything because you've just started at the beginning every single time. Stop doing that. Put a little bracket in. I love the way I'm like, stop doing that. It's a bit early for the chiller rant.
I mean, it's funny because practice what you preach. I mean, like, I'm definitely guilty of doing that sometimes. We're human beings.
Well, what can you get up in the morning and you're not quite ready for practice yet. What better way than to just blindly play something with no thought attached, Yeah. But if we're busy, so my favourite, Katie knows well, is when the repeat comes, that you literally just don't practice. Bar 41, as far as, where does it actually change? Bar 56?
I think 55, 56, yeah.
Yeah, something around there. So I tend to, for all of these studies, just put a little star where there's an exact repeat. And don't practice that. It's a waste of your time. Why would you do it twice? And then if you have to play it to someone, of course, the day before, have a little practice because it's stamina that sometimes we need. But if you're practicing this just at home for yourself, waste of time.
Yeah, it's kind of like having a really clear reason, like why you're doing something. Because I would say for me, like, I'm somebody who, I want a little bit of a safety blanket. Like, I want to know what the feeling is of, like, how tired I'm going to be at the end of it. But I'm not doing it every day. For sure, not.
Exactly.
And that's also because I know I have a certain level of strength in my arm, like, but
me too,
if you never, ever, ever do it, like, I totally agree with you, but if you never play it through before you're going to perform it, you're probably going to be really tired at the end.
Yeah, no. I would definitely not recommend that if anyone is actually playing it in a studio class or anything like that.
Yeah.
You would need to build it up over the previous week or two and do practice the playthrough at the end of your practice. But on your day-to-day, once you've analysed the first bit, you don't have to re-analyse anything in the second. Unless you put in some fingerings or something that you do need to actually put them in there, or else you'll be tripped up later.
Absolutely. So, cool. Speaking of fingerings, I mean, we've talked a lot about the bow, so left hand difficulties in this one. Hit me with some.
Well, I love it. I do have one more bow thing. Can I throw in just the last, before we let it go? Clarity obviously is very interesting in this because you do want to have instead of a kind of a slightly surfacey, indistinct sound. So we need to think as if there are consonants. So at the beginning, when I did suggest, you're doing good, healthy practice with that. But a very fast practice technique, I think, for everyone is lift the 2 fingers off the bow in the middle. Because really the consonants here are going to be your first finger and your... I think the consonants will be really, really good to develop. It's pretty tiring, so you can't do it for the whole piece. But when you do put it back, you're just a bit more aware of what the job of the pinky and the first finger are in the bow. And then it's just a bit more comfortable, I think. So if it starts sounding indistinct as you go on, especially when you get tired or if there's something tricky in the left hand, think a little bit more about the pads of the finger in the bow. And that will, quite often, if you have a firmer grip on those, I think that'll help.
That's great. I love the way you described that. Well, I had one more bow thing, but it's kind of related to the left hand, which is what I noticed in this was like when it gets more difficult for the left hand, it was really easy for me to start playing like super short. And it kind of sounds a bit naff, really. So I was going to say, yeah, you have to do this thing like once it gets hard. I think we all have this tendency as human beings to be like, ah! So I find that like when the difficulty increases for the left hand, you need to be like, a swan on the sea with your little legs underneath the surface going crazy. Yeah. But like having this sense of, I like to think of like a little like you or a little smiley face. So I'm feeling more this sort of feeling in the bow as it gets, you should be kind of feeling that the whole time probably, but more and more as it gets difficult for the left hand and higher up. Yeah. Because we need to move the bow obviously closer to the bridge as we play higher.
Yeah.
So
that's a great
just
point.
A little supporting the left hand point. But
and I think you're right for cello playing in general, that actually whenever something is technically difficult in the left hand, the bow still needs to lead. So no matter what you do, it's the sound that's important. So we spend so much time fixated on the left hand. But often, if you focus on the bow hand, that's probably going to solve a lot of your problems.
Totally.
There we are.
Here.
Proper
tips. Here. Okay, so moving on to the left hand.
Yes.
Okay. Tell me some things you think were particularly challenging about this.
My God. So I did some funny things in here, I'm not going to lie, right? So, I don't know whether this is laziness or what, but in that 2 bar that skips, I actually did a bar just for the crack. I did a 4-string bar. Now, what's really funny about that is I just did it because I was like, I would never do this in performance.
That's hilarious.
But it is hilarious. It's pure laziness. Like, obviously, that's all it is. So I just thought I'd give it a go for the entertainment. Whereas, then it's also very hard to release a 4-finger bar in time. What is it? I'm in the wrong bow. But yeah, so you really have to get up and go afterwards.
Yeah.
But for me, it was quite entertaining, in a lazy cellist type of way.
And it's not really lazy. It's kind of like, because we do have stuff that happens in rep like that. Like, I've definitely had things where, like, afterwards I feel like I need to, like unbend my finger the other way.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, might as well, like, I don't know, I'm getting used to that. Yeah, it helps.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'd recommend it for performance, but it's definitely entertaining to have a go. Quite funny.
We're all about entertainment in, proper.
If you're going to be playing popular, right?
Might as well have a good time.
Why not? This little area. So when you're getting that B flat, that's an interesting passage because you need to know where your B flat is. So I think an awful lot of practice of just hand away. I tend to think about it just with relation to where my hand is on the rim of the cello. Cool. And then my hand naturally in its shape here. So I do keep the thumb behind the neck. for this one.
Do you know what I think of? Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
go on.
Please.
I think of where the harmonic is. For all this 3-finger position stuff, I always find it like in relation to where my harmonic would be. Even the next one.
Yeah. Actually,
even
that
here,
next one. You know the one on the C. Do you leave your thumb behind or do you bring your thumb up?
I think I leave it behind because since we're
too.
coming back down, yeah.
Yeah, and I see you do it shifting on the third, the new finger, or do you use a link?
I probably just demonstrated really badly that time. I'm definitely shifting on the old finger.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
That's a decision I think people need to make.
Definitely.
And then the same again. I can't remember where the next one is. So your link there would be the B with your first finger.
Yeah.
Just so that people really have that solidified. That's great.
Another little point about this passage too, which I just think is worth mentioning. I mean, sometimes people, if they're not used to reading stuff like a lot of chromatics and string crossings like this, they're like, ah! And again, it's finding patterns. So like, this looks kind of overwhelming if you've never looked at anything like this before, but it's actually kind of like all in hand positions. So, you know, then we shift back a semitone half step, shift back another one. So you're kind of giving yourself more bang for your buck, right? Because you're looking at things in patterns rather than note by note, which is super important, I think, for learning pauper. Like, you can't get through it anywhere near as quickly if you're trying to just get every single note in tune rather than the hand position.
Yeah, I think you're dead right. And looking for those patterns everywhere, that's what we do for all of the rep, right? Anything that can kind of give you a little bit of it's like you're building jigsaw blocks or Lego blocks of the whole piece. So, and then you put it all together and it's easy, right? Love it. It's easy.
Easy.
So,
it's easy.
Well,
just practice your pauper.
When you know how, everything is actually easy, right? I also found, I'm looking at the Bärenreiter here because I have bar numbers. I actually used the International for this one because I had actually played this pauper before. Haha. So I thought I might have some of the fingerings or something in. So I found a very interesting passage for tuning was around bar 27. So we've just done. So getting that third finger into bar 27. That was killer
for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was actually this one. Because when I'm already moving and it's kind of terrible sound on that last one and my balance was off because I was already moving down. So you really have to commit. I did the wrong style bowing again, it has to be the opposite. But you do have to commit to that last note, don't you?
Yeah, and I actually, I mean, maybe this is sacrilege, but I did take a giant, like, Luftpause there. Oh, of course it didn't work for me there, but you get me. Just
I know exactly what you mean.
It's suddenly piano, so there's sort of a musical, precedent.
This is what I did wonder as well was, because the way it's written in the International, it's definitely on the second quaver or eighth note, right? So, so do you go to the first beat? I don't know.
I was not doing that, but you're so right.
Of course, though, because it's written kind of weirdly and it's halfway in between in the Bärenreiter. So I only noticed it now and was suddenly thinking, and then that idea of having quite a firm hand and then the control to suddenly. That's where the pads of the finger are going to be very, very helpful, I think.
It's so genius, actually, because, I love how Popper does this. He puts in, he's like, oh, well, you think this is easy, and you can take time. No. He's like forcing you to really practice that little transition.
Yes.
It's great. Okay, well, I'll attempt it in my run
I can't wait.
After not practicing it.
Yeah, exactly. I know you can do that. Oh my god. You know, this is like one of the skills of cellists in life. It's awesome. I presume you thought with what is it, bar 32?
Yeah.
That's a tricky passage. So that would be a passage I would recommend people practice separately when you start.
Yeah. And practice it as double stops, right? Is that the bar you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So definitely I had to there. Even thinking about the connection. So we're ready to go. Tone. So you're trying to decide what all your shifts are. Okay, so this is really fast. So international, they actually do a 2-2 jump. I don't know if you remember this from the old version, but you end up on the fourth beat going 2 and then.
Yeah.
Do you remember there was a 2-2 jump?
Yes. Yes.
And it's kind of weird because you would never choose to do that. So actually, the Baron writer would be slightly more of the style of fingering that we would do.
Let's just talk about why you would never choose to do that. I mean, it's always going to be easier to shift from. I mean, obviously there are times when we have to, like, it just sometimes happens. But if you're at all able to avoid it, you always want to shift when you cross strings to a different finger, right?
Yeah. The fingering
it's just
god
a security
yes.
thing. Yeah. So good point of bringing that up. And Baron writer being better.
Exactly. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're better for everything. I think some things are good in both editions, so it's no harm to look at both.
Yeah. Totally.
And also, you can only really do this style of fingering 2-2 jump when it is detached, because obviously you can't really do a legato. You know, it doesn't work. You would never do that in legato style playing ever. So this is pretty much the only style of thing. You might find it in orchestral rep when you're trying to keep the pattern. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, something where you're not maybe the prominent voice. Just one tiny last thing before we do our playthrough. I think just talking briefly about like when we're playing in thumb, this first study has given us some thumb on the lower two strings, which we're not usually as used to playing on, so in thumb position anyway. So I think really important for intonation on that is just your balance of your hand and making sure you're really coming around. I sometimes show my students from the side, like if you're playing on the A string, your arm's going to be there. If you're playing on the C string, your arm's going to be that much further forward. And
Absolutely.
so like just being aware of that is going to help you massively for like nailing the intonation there.
Absolutely, and we're really thinking about saying that the weight has to come from above down. So of course, if you're down like this, it can't possibly come down over that way. So you just have to think about the same angle that you think about for your bow and coming straight down for that. And then you're in the right position. So whatever your elbow needs to get into based on the size of your arm, hand, elbow, whatever. Yeah, that's where we get. I think that's
we're
great.
all different, so it's all going to be a little different for everyone. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
I love that. And the other thing as well is just to point out the different articulation which happens just occasionally. So in bar 28, we've got those lines and the dots.
Yeah.
So have a watch out through the study where those things happen. There's a particularly interesting one in bar 37 where it ends up on.
I love
it's like it's a great one. Well done, Popper. But that's where we might think of using an extra touch of vibrato. Perhaps you can experiment with vibrato or with the bow, depending on what you want in the sound. But you do have to make a difference there in those. Yeah. Okay. Shall we do it?
Going for it? Let's do it.
Let's do it. Woohoo! Playthrough.
Woohoo! Starting the poppers off right, Ailbhe. That was gorgeous. Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Super well done. What a great
thank you.
performance.
It's
Seriously.
so lovely, actually, isn't it? It's such a nice, like, woohoo! They were bubbling
I know.
brook.
Easy C major, happy days. Oh,
Yeah.
great
Love it.
stuff. All right.
Thank you. Woo! Yoo-hoo! Nice job!
Yay, thank
Amazing.
you.
Our proper
Woohoo.
journey has begun.
Oh yeah. Rocket it.
Lovely. I
Well.
love you. You transformed that first beat of the thumb position. I was very impressed altogether. Pulling it out.
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Out of the
Yeah.
bag.
Well, you
Amazing.
inspire me, Ailbhe. You inspire me
Oh,
to be great,
well.
to be better. So thank you.
What a lovely comment. I love it. That is excellent. I can't wait to do the next week's challenge with you.
I know.
Woo!
I'm very much looking forward to it too. So have a great
Chill
day.
power.
And see you soon.
too.
Woo!
Woo!
Bye. Awesome.